The call came just after sunset, when the last streaks of orange bled into the horizon and the city lights flickered awake like watchful eyes. Detective Lena Harrow stood at her kitchen counter, staring into a cup of untouched coffee that had long gone cold, when her phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed a name she hadn't seen in 5 years. Madeline Brooks, Child Services. Lena answered without hesitation. "Brooks, it's late. What's wrong?" Madeline didn't waste a second. "It's about a child, a boy, 7 years old. He drew something in class today." She exhaled shakily, as if steadying herself. "Lena, he drew a murder, a very specific one." Lena frowned. "That's not unusual. Kids draw disturbing things all the time." "This isn't a nightmare sketch. It's detailed, too detailed. A location, a victim, the exact weapon used. And the worst part?" Madeline's voice lowered. "The murder he drew hasn't been discovered yet." The room seemed to tilt. Lena straightened, gripping the counter. "Explain." "We can't talk over the phone. You need to come to the center, tonight." Lena didn't need more. She grabbed her coat, keys, and badge and drove into the night. The Child Services building sat quiet and empty under the flickering glow of a faulty parking lot lamp. Lena spotted Madeline pacing near the entrance, arms wrapped tightly around herself, face pale. She looked relieved and terrified at the same time when she saw the detective. Inside, Madeline led her down a long hallway to a small art room. School desks, crayons scattered in a bin, soft lighting that made everything appear more innocent than the air felt. On one desk lay a single sheet of paper. Lena approached slowly, pupils narrowing. A drawing. Childlike, yes, crayon strokes, but the content made her stomach sink. An wooded area sketched in dark greens and blacks. A small clearing. The outline of a man lying on his back, arms sprawled, red crayon pooled around him like thick syrup, and in the man's chest, a jagged object, gray and metallic. The proportions were wrong, exaggerated in the way children draw pain they don't understand. But the violence, the scene, too precise. "What is that?" Lena murmured, pointing at the object in the victim's chest. "A screwdriver," Madeline whispered. "The boy insisted." Lena studied the figure, the wounds, the angle of the tool. It was consistent with a stabbing motion, downward, brutal, repeated. And the most disturbing part? The victim's face was drawn with haunting accuracy, eyes open, mouth frozen in a half gasp. Lena leaned closer. "I know that face." Madeline swallowed. "The boy drew a name on the back." Lena flipped the page. A single word in shaky handwriting. Henley. Detective Marcus Henley. Her partner, retired just 2 months ago. Last she heard, he'd moved to a cabin outside the city, near a wooded area. Lena's pulse spiked. "This is a coincidence," she said, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. "Kids overhear things. Maybe he heard a name." Madeline shook her head. "The boy doesn't know who Marcus Henley is. He's 7. He's never met a detective." "How did the teacher react?" "She thought he'd seen something, but when she asked him where he saw this, he said—" A creak interrupted them. A small door at the back of the room opened. A little boy stood there. Tiny frame, brown hair messy from hours of fidgeting, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit by its ear. His name was Noah. He looked at Lena with the big, silent eyes of a child who had seen far too much. Madeline crouched to his level. "Sweetheart, we're just talking about your drawing. Detective Harrow wants to understand it. Is that okay?" Noah nodded slowly. Lena approached him carefully, mindful of every movement. "Hi, Noah. My name is Lena. I wanted to ask you about your picture. Can you tell me who the man is?" Noah didn't speak. Instead, he shuffled to the desk, picked up the drawing and held it out to Lena with trembling fingers. She crouched to mirror him. "You can tell me anything," she said gently. Noah's voice was barely a whisper. "He's the man who dies tonight." Lena felt a cold, electric jolt run down her spine. "Tonight? Honey, how do you know that?" Noah stared past her, eyes unfocused, haunted. "I saw it happen." "How?" Lena pressed. He shook his head hard, as if the memory physically hurt. "I close my eyes, and then I'm not me. I'm there. I see things." Madeline stepped between them protectively, but Lena raised her hand. "No, let him speak." Noah hugged his rabbit tighter. "He was walking in the woods. I think he was looking for something, or someone. Then a man came behind him. He pushed him down and—" His breath hitched. "And he hurt him. A lot." Lena felt nausea coil in her gut. "Do you know the man who hurt him?" Noah hesitated. Then, in tiny, shaking strokes of a finger, he pointed to a corner of the drawing. Lena hadn't noticed it before. A shadow figure, no face, just a silhouette, but drawn with perfect intent. Noah whispered, "He's watching now." The room seemed suddenly colder, as if something unseen had brushed past her neck. Lena steadied her breathing. "Did your mom or dad ever take you to the woods?" asked Lena, trying to redirect. Noah shook his head. "They're not alive." Madeline winced. "He lost both parents last year in a home invasion. Noah was hiding under the stairs. He saw the killer's shoes through the slats." Lena's heart clenched. The trauma alone could explain nightmares, sketches, even morbid imagination. But the name Henley, the accuracy of the wound, the detail. She needed to act. "Madeline," Lena said, rising, "I need to call this in. If Henley is in danger, we need to get to him now." But before Madeline could respond, Noah tugged Lena's coat sleeve. "He's already dead," he whispered, voice eerily calm. "You won't find him alive." Lena crouched again. "Noah, sweetie, you couldn't know that." He shook his head and pointed at the drawing again. Only now Lena noticed something new, something she hadn't seen initially. The date, written in red crayon at the bottom, "Tonight, 10:14 p.m. She checked her watch. 10:07 p.m. Her pulse rocketed. "Madeline, keep Noah here. Don't let anyone take him anywhere. Lock the building if you have to. Lena, what are you going to do? Get to the woods and pray I'm not too late." She grabbed the drawing, shoved it into her coat pocket, and sprinted out of the building. But as she reached her car, she noticed something that made her freeze. A dark sedan parked across the street. Engine off, driver barely visible, and in the back seat, a silhouette of a man, watching, holding something long and metallic. A screwdriver. Before Lena could react, the sedan pulled away, its tires whispering against wet pavement. The taillights bled red into the night, vanishing around the corner. Lena stood frozen, realization crashing into her. Whoever killed Noah's parents, whoever Noah drew, whoever might be killing Henley tonight, wasn't in the woods. He had been here, watching the child, and now Lena knew Lena was involved. She jumped into her car and tore down the road, the drawing crinkling in her pocket like a heartbeat. Tonight would not end cleanly. Tonight she was chasing a murderer who already knew her name. The forest road was a narrow black vein cutting through miles of unbroken dark. Lena's headlights carved shallow tunnels of visibility between the trees, but everything beyond that halo felt alive, shifting, listening, waiting. Rain hit the windshield in small, cold taps, gathering speed as the storm rolled in. Her wipers dragged across the glass with an irritated squeal, barely keeping up. The drawing lay on the passenger seat. Red crayon, a body, a screwdriver, a name, Henley, her old partner, stubborn, reckless, investigative instincts sharper than survival instincts. He had mentioned the solitude of the cabin, a place to write, he said, a break from all the noise, a break that tomorrow's headlines might call a burial site. Lena pushed the accelerator. 10 miles to his cabin, maybe less. She replayed Noah's frail voice in her mind. I saw it happen. Not a premonition, not a hallucination, a memory, a vision of something he had no physical way of witnessing. It implied only 2 possibilities. 1, the boy was catastrophically traumatized, recreating the murder of his parents in a new scenario. Or 2, someone wanted Lena to believe a murder was happening, using Noah as a messenger. But Noah's trembling hands, his haunted stare, the accuracy of the drawing, and then the sedan outside the center, the screwdriver in the silhouette's hand. No, this wasn't manipulation. This was pattern. A killer who had already taken 2 lives using a screwdriver, a rare murder weapon, was now preparing a 3rd. Henley's life hung by minutes. She pressed the gas harder. A sign emerged from the darkness. Black Ridge Nature Reserve, 2 miles. Henley's cabin sat just beyond the tree line. The wooded air thickened as she drove deeper, branches arching overhead like interlocked fingers. Her cell phone lost reception. The world isolated into silence, rain, and engine hum. Finally, she spotted the narrow gravel turnoff. She turned onto it, tires crunching over stones. The cabin appeared slowly, as though reluctant to materialize. A small wooden structure with a single porch light flickering weakly, surrounded by towering pines. A truck, Henley's truck, sat parked lopsided beside the porch. Lena's pulse kicked. He was home, or had been. She stopped the car and climbed out, every sense sharpening. Henley, she called. Wind swallowed her voice. She tried again. Marcus, it's Lena. Nothing. Her hand hovered near her holster as she approached the stairs. Drops of rain pattered off the roof and into her hair. A faint metallic tang drifted in the cold air, coppery, unmistakable. She scanned the area. No footprints in the mud except Henley's and one other, heavier, deeper, made by boots with a distinct diamond tread pattern. Her breath steadied. The same footprint pattern found at Noah's parents' crime scene. A chill slithered down her spine. The killer had already been here. She mounted the last step and tried the door. Unlocked. She entered slowly. The cabin interior was dim. Only the wood stove's dying embers cast a faint orange glow. The living room was small, bookshelves, a messy table, a laptop left open on a draft of a manuscript. A half-finished mug of tea sat beside it, steam long gone. Henley, Lena whispered. No answer. Her eyes moved to the floor. Dark spots, leading across the hardwood in staggering intervals. Blood. Her muscles tightened. She followed the trail to a hallway leading to the bedroom. More blood, more chaos. The bed sheets ripped off, a lamp knocked over, signs of a struggle, violent, frantic, desperate. But no Henley. Lena scanned the room carefully, and then she saw something. More drawings. Her breath caught. Laid neatly on the desk were several sketches, pencil, not crayon, but unmistakably drawn by the same hand. Noah's. She picked up the top one. It showed a cabin, this cabin, and a window with a dark silhouette staring inside. Another showed a figure dragging an unconscious man, Henley, through the trees. The last one, Lena's fingers trembled. It depicted a shallow ravine she recognized from the reserve map, a place called Miller's Drop, notorious for accidents and suicides. And there, sketched in deep, frantic strokes, was Henley lying at the bottom, a screwdriver in his chest, exactly like the classroom drawing. Jesus, Lena whispered. The boy hadn't drawn a murder. He'd drawn a sequence, a progression. He drew what he saw the killer do next. And the killer must have known Noah could do it. That's why he was watching the center. That's why he left. He wasn't running. He was finishing the final step. Lena grabbed the cabin mat from Henley's wall, eyes darting over it. Miller's drop wasn't far, a 15-minute walk through the woods. The killer wouldn't risk driving. It would draw attention. He'd move on foot, dragging Henley's unconscious body through the trees. If he wasn't already dead. She bolted out the door. The rain now came in thick, relentless sheets. The trail of blood in the mud was faint but visible. Dragging marks, boot prints. She followed. Branches whipped at her clothes and face as she pushed deeper into the forest. The path narrowed, the storm roaring above like the sky itself was tearing open. Her breath fogged in the cold air. Her boots sank into soft earth. Night pressed around her like a physical weight. And then she heard it. A grunt, choked, muffled. Just ahead, she froze and dropped into a crouch, ears straining. Another sound. A wheeze, weak, painful. "Henley," she whispered. She moved forward, slow and silent, weaving between trees until the forest opened into a steep slope. Miller's drop. There, illuminated by a bolt of lightning, she saw them. Henley on his knees, hands bound, head drooping forward. And behind him, a man dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by a hood, gripping a screwdriver raised high. Time fractured. Lena didn't think. She moved. "Drop it!" she shouted, gun drawn. The killer froze. Henley's head lifted weakly, eyes dull, unfocused. "Lena," he croaked. The killer turned slightly toward her, just enough to show a partial profile. Sharp jaw, lean build, controlled posture. Not a random drifter. Someone trained, calculated, someone who killed with precision. Lena held her aim steady. "I said drop the weapon." The man tilted his head, expression unreadable. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not wide, not manic, just knowing. He whispered, "You're too late," and slammed the screwdriver down. Lena fired. Henley collapsed. The killer stumbled as the bullet clipped his shoulder, but didn't fall. He turned and sprinted into the woods. Lena rushed forward, slipping in mud, catching herself on a root. "Henley," she called, dropping beside him. His breaths were shallow, bubbling with blood. The screwdriver's handle protruded from his chest and bedded deep. She pressed her hand against the wound, trembling. "Stay with me, Marcus, stay with me." But Henley's eyes were already glazing, staring beyond her. "Lena," he whispered. "He knew your name." Her chest tightened. "When?" she demanded. Henley swallowed hard. "Before he grabbed me. He said he'd been watching you." Lena felt ice crawl under her skin. Henley exhaled softly, as if releasing the last of his pain. "Find him," his voice cracked, "before he finds the boy." His hand slipped from hers. His breathing stopped. The rain washed blood from the leaves around them. It puddled, diluted, carried away by gravity toward the ravine bottom. Lena arose slowly, fury mixing with dread. She'd lost him, but the killer was still nearby, bleeding, dangerous, and now he knew Noah was the only witness who could expose him, and he certainly knew Lena was the only detective who believed the boy. She took one step forward. A twig snapped to her left. She spun. A silhouette darted between trees, too quick to aim at, too quiet to track. He was gone, but not far. Rain pounded. The woods swallowed the night whole. Lena stared into the darkness, jaw clenched. "This isn't over," she whispered. The forest didn't respond, but something in the shadows felt like it was listening. Detective Mara Linton returned to her desk at the precinct long after the others had gone home, the corridors dim and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights forming a kind of electric whisper that irritated the back of her skull. But sleep was not an option. Tommy Hale's drawing was spread across her desk, secured under a paperweight, a disturbingly detailed murder scene sketched by a child who had seen nothing and claimed to have invented the entire thing. Yet the image matched a real homicide she had not yet made public, a homicide that had been discovered barely 48 hours earlier. The victim, a 32-year-old accountant named Evan Proctor, had been found slumped over the steering wheel of his compact sedan, engine still running, throat slashed with a thin blade that her forensic team believed to be some kind of utility knife, the kind common in hardware stores and found in the pockets of construction workers, custodians, and far too many people to narrow down as suspects. But Tommy had drawn it precisely down to the angle of the wound and the posture of the body, and now Mara found herself replaying his halting voice, the way he had said, "I just draw what I see in my head," while avoiding her gaze like a child who feared he'd done something wrong. Though he wasn't frightened of her, he was frightened of the picture itself, and that fear gnawed at Mara's intuition as she traced the edges of the drawing with her eyes, trying to understand whether Tommy was an accidental witness, a child used by someone else, or, in a more troubling possibility, the child of the killer himself. As she sifted through the thin case file, Evan Proctor, unmarried, modest income, no criminal ties, lived alone, her phone vibrated against the desk. Dr. Leela Hart, the forensic psychologist assisting the department's Child Services Division, had sent a message. "We need to talk again about Tommy. Something's off." Mara rubbed her forehead, grabbed her coat, and headed back into the night, the cool air jolting her awake as she drove toward Leela's office across town, each passing streetlight a brief flare of clarity before plunging her thoughts back into uncertainty. When she arrived, Leela led her to her private consultation room, walls decorated with children's drawings, bright childish splashes of color that contrasted sharply with the monochrome horror of Tommy's sketch, and Leela sat down heavily, hands folded atop a manila folder. "Mara, Tommy's drawing isn't the only one," she said quietly, sliding the folder across the table, and Mara opened it to find more drawings, 3 separate sheets, each showing scenes disturbingly similar to other unsolved local cases from the past year. A woman lying face down in a bathtub, her wrist dangling over the tub's edge, a man collapsing by a loading dock with a smear of blood across his shirt, a third figure kneeling in tall grass, hands bound behind his back, head tilted at an unnatural angle as though snapped, each picture capturing major details of real classified crime scenes that Tommy could not possibly know. Mara felt the walls tighten around her as she asked Leela how long she'd had these, and Leela replied that she'd received them over the past few months, but had assumed, wrongly she now realized, that they were products of an overactive imagination sketched by a child processing some kind of trauma, though she couldn't find any documented trauma in Tommy's history. Mara paced the room, heart pounding steadily as she considered the implications. A child producing detailed depictions of murders he should not know about, drawing them in advance of speaking to any detective, and doing so without any sign of coercion or staged manipulation, unless someone had been feeding him details, someone who had access to private investigative information, someone who had been present at the crime scenes themselves. The idea chilled her, because if Tommy wasn't inventing these drawings and wasn't merely witnessing them, then he was receiving them from someone else, someone deeply connected to the murders, someone who trusted a 7-year-old enough to confide in him or indoctrinate him. And Tommy, due to his young mind's inability to process the reality, might be turning those confessions into drawings. Mara asked Leela if Tommy ever mentioned anyone he talked to, family friends, neighbors, teachers, and Leela said he mentioned no names, but he did refer to the quiet man, a phrase repeated 3 times during their session earlier that day, though Tommy refused to elaborate. Mara sat down again, brows furrowed, and asked for Tommy's background. His mother, Julie Hale, worked as a bartender, often on late-night shifts, and his father was absent, not deceased, just gone. And according to Julie's reports and school evaluations, Tommy was a quiet child, introspective, rarely causing trouble, though he had recently begun waking up from nightmares and showing signs of sleepwalking, behaviors that often indicated internalized stress or exposure to something disturbing. Mara pressed for more, trying to uncover whether Tommy had said anything that indicated he had been in danger, but Leela shook her head, saying he seemed unsettled but not physically harmed. It was as if the violence he drew wasn't something done to him, but something happening near him, close enough to seep into his unconscious, but far enough that he couldn't articulate it in words. Mara leaned back, thinking of the crime scenes, isolated locations, late nights, victims with no obvious connection, and asked whether Tommy spent time alone at night, perhaps in the vicinity of his mother's workplace, but Leela admitted they didn't know. Julie Hale had been difficult to reach, her phone always dying, her availability sporadic, and Mara felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she remembered Julie's calm, tired expression from earlier that day, the way she had brushed off Tommy's drawings as nothing more than creepy kid doodles, though something about her tone felt too dismissive, almost rehearsed, and now Mara wondered whether Julie knew more than she said, or worse, whether Julie had allowed someone around Tommy whom she shouldn't have. Deciding she needed answers immediately, Mara thanked Lila and headed straight for Julie's apartment, a rundown complex on the east side of town where the stairwell lights flickered and the vending machine in the lobby hummed ominously. She climbed the stairs and knocked on the peeling door of Unit 3B, and after a long moment, Julie opened it, looking exhausted, her eyes red as though she'd been crying or drinking or both. And when she saw Mara, she stiffened slightly, asking whether something had happened to Tommy. But Tommy was asleep at Lila's office for observation, so Mara reassured her before pushing gently with questions. Where she had been the night of Evan Proctor's murder, whether Tommy had been with her, and whether anyone had been around Tommy recently. Julie bristled under the interrogation, crossing her arms tightly and looking away as she claimed she had worked a double shift and that Tommy had been with a neighbor, Mrs. Garvey. But when Mara asked for Mrs. Garvey's contact information, Julie hesitated, fumbling for words, then mumbled something about not remembering the apartment number, which made Mara's suspicion sharpen like a blade. She gently but firmly insisted that Julie sit down, and Julie finally did, sinking into a stained armchair as she admitted, after several tense, halting breaths, that she had been letting her brother, Tommy's Uncle Darren, watch the boy on nights she had to work because Darren had recently gotten back on his feet and needed a place to stay. But he wasn't staying here anymore, and when Mara asked why, Julie grew pale and whispered that Darren made Tommy uncomfortable and she had told him to leave 2 weeks ago, though she refused to specify what had happened. Mara pressed harder, asking whether Darren had ever been violent, and Julie shook her head, saying he wasn't violent, just strange, someone who didn't talk much, someone who Tommy had once called the quiet man. Mara felt her skin prickle as she leaned forward and asked where Darren was now, and Julie whispered that she didn't know, that he had left in anger and she hadn't seen him since. And the room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator as Mara's mind raced with the realization that Tommy's drawings weren't random at all. They were memories or impressions of things he had seen or overheard while his Uncle Darren, a man described as both silent and unsettling, was alone with him, perhaps even taking him along unknowingly or unintentionally exposing him to crime scenes. And if Darren was the killer, then Tommy might be the only living witness to a string of murders. Mara stood up slowly, thanking Julie without revealing the depth of her fear, and stepped into the hallway with the certainty that Darren Hale had to be found immediately, before he killed again, and before he decided that the little boy who drew his crimes had become too much of a liability to keep alive. Detective Mara Linton spent the night hunting down every trace of Darren Hale, but the man was a ghost. No active bank cards, no current address, no employment records in the last 4 years, and the one arrest on his record, a misdemeanor trespassing charge, listed a former construction job that had gone bankrupt years earlier. Yet despite his paper-thin history, every detail about him set Mara's instincts on fire, because men like Darren, quiet, transient, unanchored, often drifted into crimes of opportunity. And if he'd been living intermittently with Julie and Tommy, then Tommy's drawings were no longer coincidences, but silent cries for help, attempts to express what he couldn't articulate. Mara drove across the city as dawn approached, checking the last known addresses, abandoned job sites, and the halfway house where Darren had briefly stayed before leaving without notice. And at each stop she gathered fragments of a pattern. Darren didn't socialize, rarely spoke, kept to himself, and often wandered late at night, returning with dirt on his clothes or smelling of gasoline. And one former roommate described him as gone in the eyes, a hollowed-out man who didn't blink enough, a detail that lingered in Mara's thoughts as she circled back toward the station. She spread Tommy's drawings across her desk again, each one a crime scene frozen in ink, and she began arranging them chronologically: the bathtub drowning from 9 months ago, the loading dock stabbing from 6 months ago, the bound victim in the tall grass from 3 months ago, and now the newest, the slashed throat in the car from 48 hours ago. All murders with no clear relationship between victims, but all showing signs of a perpetrator who had grown increasingly confident, increasingly bold, and increasingly sloppy. Because if Darren was the killer, bringing Tommy along wasn't just negligent, it was the behavior of someone unraveling. Mara picked up Tommy's first drawing, the bathtub scene, and studied the background for the first time. Faint scribbles along the tile wall, barely noticeable unless one looked closely, a shape that seemed almost deliberate, a stick figure silhouette, tall and thin, drawn in black, something Tommy had seen, someone standing in the doorway as he peeked inside, someone eerily still. Her stomach tightened. The child hadn't just imagined the killer, he had drawn him. She grabbed her coat and headed to the one place she had left to check, the vacant warehouse where Darren had once worked security before the company went bankrupt. According to city records, the building was set for demolition but hadn't yet been cleared, and men like Darren often returned to places that were familiar, silent, forgotten. The warehouse sat at the end of an industrial road, surrounded by rusted fencing and shattered windows that stared like dead eyes into the morning fog, and Mara moved quietly through the entrance, flashlight in hand, her footsteps echoing across the dusty floor. She saw signs of recent activity, a corner where blankets and old shirts formed a makeshift bed, a stack of empty canned food, cigarette butts arranged deliberately in a circle as though someone had passed long hours staring at the center. She crouched, examining the floor, noticing scratches in the concrete, drag marks. They weren't new. Some were months old, some weeks, some days, overlapping into a chaotic pattern of lines that were initially shaped by bodies being pulled, arranged, or positioned. Her throat tightened as she whispered to herself, "This is where he staged them." Suddenly, a shuffle echoed from the far end of the warehouse, a soft step, followed by another, and Mara rose cautiously, hand gripping her firearm as she moved toward the source. But it wasn't Darren she found. It was Mrs. Garvey, the elderly neighbor Julie claimed had been watching Tommy, standing in the shadows with her hands trembling, a small purse dangling from her wrist. When Mara shined her flashlight on her, the woman flinched, whispering, "I didn't know where else to go." Mara urged her to sit, asking what she was doing here, and the older woman confessed that she hadn't watched Tommy in months, that Julie had lied, that she had tried to intervene once after hearing Darren yell at the boy, but Julie begged her not to call the police, fearing social services would take Tommy away. Mara's pulse quickened as Mrs. Garvey continued, voice trembling. She had seen Darren leaving the apartment late at night, sometimes with Tommy in tow, and once she saw Darren return alone, staring at nothing as though listening to whispers in the air, and the next morning Tommy wouldn't speak to anyone for hours. Mara asked her why she came here, and Mrs. Garvey said she followed Darren once, weeks ago, after seeing him drag something heavy from the trunk of a car into this warehouse, but she ran home out of fear after hearing a scream from inside. Mara felt the air thicken with dread. The warehouse wasn't an old workplace, it was a burial ground. She told Mrs. Garvey to stay behind her and not touch anything as she moved deeper into the shadows. At the far wall, hidden behind a fallen beam, she found a section of floor that seemed uneven, dirt piled unnaturally over a square area, and as she knelt to examine it, she noticed tire tracks, footprints, large ones and smaller ones, a child's size, fading but unmistakable. The realization hit her so hard her hands trembled. Tommy had been here. He had stood on this very ground, perhaps watching, perhaps crying, while his uncle carried out his murders. She closed her eyes briefly, forcing down the ache in her chest, and then she saw something glinting in the corner. A small keychain, plastic, shaped like a cartoon rocket, smudged with dirt. She recognized it immediately. It had hung on Tommy's backpack earlier that day. Panic surged as she scanned the warehouse, shouting his name though she knew he wasn't here, hoping somehow he might appear, that her instincts were wrong. But Tommy wasn't in sight, and that meant Darren Hale had taken him again. She radioed the station, her voice steady despite the ice gripping her spine, reporting Darren Hale as a kidnapping suspect and requesting immediate surveillance on Julie Hale's apartment and the surrounding area. But before she could finish the transmission, her radio crackled with another voice, Officer Henley from the precinct, saying, "Detective Linton, we just received a call from Child Services. Tommy Hale is missing from Dr. Hart's office. He vanished 20 minutes ago." Mara felt her blood run cold. She grabbed Mrs. Garvey's arm and hurried her outside, placing her safely behind the patrol car she had called for backup, then jumped into her vehicle, tires screeching across the pavement. If Darren had taken Tommy from the psychologist's office, then he wasn't hiding anymore. He was accelerating, panicking, recognizing that someone was closing in on him, and panic made killers violent. Mara's phone buzzed as she drove, and she answered without looking, hearing Dr. Hart's trembling voice. "He didn't speak, Mara. He just walked in, took Tommy by the hand and told him it was time to finish what they started. I tried to intervene, but he pushed me. I'm so sorry. I think Tommy went willingly." Mara gripped the wheel tighter, fighting the urge to shout. Of course Tommy had gone willingly, because children trusted familiarity even when it felt wrong, and Darren had exploited that trust for months. She asked where they went, and Dr. Hart whispered, "Tommy pointed to your picture on my desk as they left. I think Darren knows you're the one following him." Mara's heart lurched as her phone buzzed again. An unknown number. She answered, breath held, and a soft, shaking voice whispered from the other end. A child's voice. "Detective Linton? Uncle Darren says he needs you to come alone." The line crackled. "He says we're going somewhere important." A pause, ragged breathing. "He says I should draw you next." Then the line went dead. Detective Mara Linton sped through the thinning morning fog, her pulse beating in rapid, deliberate strikes as she replayed Tommy's trembling voice, every word etched into her nerves like a blade. "He says I should draw you next." A threat, a warning, and a cry for help all at once. And she knew that Darren Hale was spiraling into the final stage of his unraveling, a cornered predator clinging to whatever twisted ritual justified his killings, and for reasons she had not yet understood, he wanted her there, alone, following a plan only he could decipher. She pulled up the GPS trace from Julie's abandoned phone, the one she had tossed carelessly on the table during their conversation, and noticed a recently opened location, an old rest area 30 miles north of town, a place decommissioned years ago after a series of violent altercations were reported on the property, a place where isolation was guaranteed and help was far away. A perfect stage for whatever Darren intended to do with Tommy. And Mara turned sharply toward the highway, foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, her sirens off to avoid alerting him too soon. Every mile seemed to stretch unnervingly long as she mentally reconstructed Darren's psyche. A silent man, socially withdrawn, easily overlooked, harboring a darkness that had grown over years of instability, rejection, and fractured interpersonal relationships. A man who had sought connection but only understood control, who had taken Tommy not only as a witness but as an extension of himself, a blank canvas onto which he could project his sick narratives, using the boy's drawings as trophies, as documentation, as a way to immortalize his crimes without ever speaking a word. When Mara finally approached the rest area, the building looked like a corpse of concrete and mold, its roof sagging, windows cracked like brittle bones, graffiti scrawled across the walls in faded tags, and the surrounding lot was empty except for a single vehicle, a rusted blue sedan with its trunk slightly ajar, the same model described by a witness near the scene of the bathtub murder nearly a year ago. The same model that had never appeared on traffic cameras because Darren knew how to move through the city's blind spots, and Mara parked her car at an angle, shielding herself as she stepped out into the quiet hum of wind passing through the broken structure. She announced herself softly, calling out Tommy's name first, then Darren's, and for a moment there was only silence before a tiny voice echoed from inside the rest stop restroom. "Detective Linton, we're in here!" And Mara moved quickly but cautiously, firearm drawn, not rushing but maintaining a steady, controlled pace, every sense sharpened as she pushed open the restroom door to find Tommy sitting on the tiled floor, knees pulled up to his chest, clutching his rocket-shaped keychain tightly with shaking fingers. His face was streaked with tears, but he wasn't hurt, and he looked at her with wide, desperate eyes, whispering, "He said you would come. He said this is your turn." A soft scraping sound behind her made Mara spin, but Darren wasn't standing over her. He was leaning against the wall beside the far stall, arms loose at his sides, head tilted slightly, eyes empty but somehow expectant, like a man watching a scene he'd rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. He wasn't holding a weapon, he wasn't even moving. "You see it, don't you?" he murmured, his voice thin and cracked from disuse. "The boy draws what matters. He sees things the way they should be. I just clean up the rest." Mara kept her gun trained on him, ordering him to step away from the child, but Darren only shook his head slowly. "You all look the same to me. All of you wandering, wasting your chances, walking past each other like ghosts. But Tommy, he sees the truth. He sees how people end." Tommy whimpered softly, shrinking further against the wall, and Mara took a small step closer, positioning herself between boy and killer, her voice calm and low as she told Darren the truth he never expected. Tommy didn't see anything mystical or prophetic. He saw the crimes because Darren exposed him to them, because Darren brought him along, because the boy witnessed enough shadows and suffering that his mind filled in the rest, converting trauma into drawings, attempting to understand violence that no child should ever see. Darren's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching, and Mara recognized the shift, denial collapsing inward, rage and fear clawing to the surface as he whispered, "No, he saw me. He saw what I was meant to do, didn't he, Tommy?" But Tommy shook his head rapidly, covering his ears. Mara seized the moment, stepping forward and commanding Darren to drop to his knees, and for a second it seemed he might comply, shoulders sagging, eyes wavering, until he lunged, not at Mara, but toward Tommy, a last frantic attempt to seize control, to pull the boy back into his world of silence and blood. Mara fired once, a single controlled shot that struck Darren in the shoulder and sent him crashing to the floor, where he writhed and whimpered like a wounded animal, muttering incoherently about unfinished stories, about drawings left incomplete, his voice breaking into sobs as officers who had followed Mara at a distance per her earlier dispatch rushed in to secure him. Tommy clung to Mara, shaking violently as she lifted him gently, whispering reassurances, while the other officers cuffed Darren and read him his rights, though he barely heard them, absorbed instead in the unraveling of his delusion. Mara carried Tommy outside, away from the decay of the building, into the soft morning light where paramedics hurried over to assess him, but the boy wouldn't leave her side, gripping her coat tightly as though letting go would cause the world to collapse again. Julie arrived minutes later, sobbing as she hugged her son, promising him safety, though Mara watched with a complicated mix of anger and empathy. Julie's neglect had endangered Tommy, but she was not the architect of the violence. She was simply overwhelmed, naive, clinging to any form of help, even when it came in the form of her broken, dangerous brother. As Darren was loaded into the patrol car, his eyes locked once more on Tommy, not with hatred, but with a hollow longing, a possessiveness that chilled Mara deeper than any verbal threat could, and he whispered, barely audible, "He drew me first," as though it were some sacred truth revealed. But Tommy didn't hear him. He was looking at Mara now, eyes tired but safe, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of paper that he pressed into her hand. "I drew this," he said softly. Mara unfolded it cautiously, bracing herself for another nightmare, but instead she found a simple sketch, a tall figure standing between a small child and a shadowy shape behind them. Not a crime scene, not a death, but a moment of protection, a depiction of her shielding Tommy, drawn before she even arrived at the rest stop. For the first time since the case began, Mara felt warmth in her chest, the fragile spark of hope amid the ashes of fear, and as she placed a comforting hand on Tommy's back, she whispered, "You're safe now," knowing fully well that the drawings, the darkness, and the memories would take time to heal, but this chapter, this nightmare, was finally over. And in that quiet moment, with the sirens fading and the sun rising, the eerie trail of drawings that had led her through a labyrinth of crime and trauma settled into a final picture, a child not defined by the horrors he had seen, but by the strength he had survived. And the story, his story, would no longer be written in fear.